After 14 days of starting, one of the biggest and boldest decision of India, that is the demonetization drive of the government. We are here with one of the most prominent economists of India, Professor Simrit Kaur from University of Delhi, Faculty of Management Studies, and she would answer some of our unanswered questions. Hello ma'am.
Hello. Thank
What
you
are
so
your
much.
views on the current government's move on demonetization of Indian currency?
See, the very word demonetization, I would try to link it up with the word demons. And to the extent we are trying to kill the demons through demonetization, that is basically what we are addressing. And unlike most of the other policies, sometimes in economics you don't have a win-win situation, so there are pros and cons associated with it. And our idea is to what extent demonetization is directly going to impact whatever the objectives were. And in this context, obviously concerns such as counterfeit and terrorism activity comes into the forefront, as well as the impact of the black economy and corruption. And to this, obviously probably over time one could address the short-term impacts are going to be different from the long-term impacts. Sectoral impacts are also going to vary. So we could probably deal on it as and when we proceed with
Exactly.
further addressing the issues.
So what do you think would be the impacts on Indian economy on the macroeconomic front and the microeconomic front? And which sectors do you think will benefit the most and which sectors do you think that would lose on with this move?
Okay. The entire system of demonetization, one could look at it from two perspectives: is the policy right and are the processes in place? Um, Talking about the policy aspect, we don't have much in history to compare the present demonetization moves. In general, you have seen that people do move away from the currency and bring in another currency, but that is generally at post hyperinflation kind of a scenario. Zimbabwe had experienced it. But to the extent that India has been proactive with this reform and not reactive, in itself means probably the policy makers know what they are doing. And also, we need more time to ascertain what the implications would be, and most of it would depend upon how well they are administered. But simple economics does tell us that all of a sudden, if a huge amount of currency in circulation overnight is taken away, it is certainly going to impact your price levels, your GDP growth rates, your investments, consumption pattern, and at least in the first 2 quarters, which we call the short-term impacts, are going to be adverse, but with the hope that the long-term impacts on most of these variables are going to be favorable.
The Sensex is moving down in the short term impact. How do you see that it is going to be phased out in the long term?
See, Sensex is something which is not necessarily based only on the fundamentals of an economy, and a lot of it depends upon speculation as well as aspects which are taking place globally. Now, this particular aspect of Modi now, with this demonetization, is what is happening within the domestic territory. But Sensex, to the extent your capital accounts are more convertible and you have more of movements of portfolio investment, Trumponomics has played an important role. Euro economics has playing an important role. Brexit has played an important role. So directly comparing demonetization with the one-to-one changes in the stock market probably is not in the right spirit. One needs to give it more time. And as we mentioned, so long as the fundamentals of the economic are going to go down in the immediate period, Sensex is going to take a hit, especially because when you see that the currency in circulation becomes lower, people are going to withdraw money from the stock exchanges to finance whatever investment needs are. But over time, with more deposits coming into the banking system and the currency and the liquidity in the economy improves, and to the extent those fundamentals are impacting your stock exchange movements, things should stabilize. But as mentioned, in the current system of internationalization and globalization, linking Sensex to a particular policy of demonetization may not necessarily be looking at from the right angle.
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, one of the biggest objective of demonetization was stopping terrorism, as you mentioned in your speech further also. that it was one of the biggest motive of the government that the terrorism and counter-terrorism should stop. You're working for with the Indian-Pakistan counter-terrorism attack system. So what are your views that starting of 2000 rupees notes and currently we have found that in Kashmir there are illegal notes again which are being found out with the terrorists around 4 lakh rupees. So what do you think that this policy would make an impact towards this counter-terrorism and what are your views on it?
Okay. I'll probably link what you're saying with the theory first and then bring it to the practical aspect. A long time back, I read a book by Collier, The Four Traps, Development Traps, he talks about. And he mentions conflict trap to be one such trap, the others being countries which are rich in natural. So there's a natural resource trap. There is countries which are landlocked, that is also another development trap. And bad governance is another development trap. Now, to the extent we are able to deal with the conflict trap by reducing the amount of counterfeit currency in circulation, we are expected to have dealt with the conflict trap of it. Now, how does a conflict lead to a trap? It basically happens because of two kinds of dividends which a country is not able to reap. Literature talks about a dynamic peace dividend and a static peace dividend, which means promoting peace by itself has dividends. And again, I think around 2008, we estimated the peace dividends to be about 13% of the global GDP. So these are huge amounts of dividends we are talking about. Ideally, the dynamic dividend comes from because when peace is introduced into a system, you have children going to school, so human capital is built up, social capital is built up. And static dividends come because the government start reallocating the resources from the so-called defense, very important but nevertheless unproductive from an economic point of view, to more development projects. So it is very important to focus on the conflict. Now, what kind of people become anti-state actors? It's important to understand that. Generally, people who are grieved with the present system, so grievance forces them to join anti-state bodies, or alternatively, the greed pulls them. So, to the extent the anti-social elements have that money to lure the youth, especially the youth, you will have both grievance pushing the youth into anti-social, and you will also have forces pulling them. With this particular aspect, we will be able to address both the issues. On the pull front, when you don't have these organizations having liquid assets with which to lure the public, such kind of activities are expected to come down. Grievance, to the extent again, peace brings about its own dividends, and if these youth itself find more job opportunities, and they will not be pushed into the system. So it is very important to deal with this. And often I also feel that it's our defense personnel who are spending days and nights either at plus 50 degrees or minus 30 degrees taking care of us. Why is it that the civilians are not willing to, bring about a peace? We have to sacrifice in order to get the peace. It is a turbulent phase, undoubtedly, but we have to be spirited enough to deal with this turbulence.
Ma'am, but again we have noticed that there are duplicate notes which are being started to flow in the economy. So how do you think that it would affect the counter-terrorism and...
I totally agree. This move by itself is not the only move.
Exactly.
If this move could have dealt with it, every 3 years we would have done the demonetization. So demonetization is only one such move, and evidence has shown us that at least in the past few days, the terrorism activities on the J&K frontier have come down, and we also have the Asia Terrorism Portal talking about most of the terrorism activities being associated. The fatalities are generally coming from the terrorism in J&K and left-wing extremism. So to that extent, if it curbs, it's too early to say how much it has curbed. But yes, a one odd move suddenly will probably bring in more ways of doing the same thing again. So you have to think ahead and continue bringing about reforms. But to the extent it's a step in the right direction, it should be welcomed. But obviously you can't have it every now and then. There are costs attached to demonetization. So you have to look at other ways of bringing about peace. This is just one method, a shock kind of a treatment.
Ma'am, so considering the fact that 60% of Indian economy lives in rural background, 20% of them have access towards e-wallets and mobile banking system, Do you think that this move is certainly premature-ish and it do lack some implementations and planning aspects?
Okay, I totally accept your point. There are teething problems, but also if you look at the economic development of India, generally it has been seen worldwide that as you develop, the percentage of the cash economy reduces and the cashless transactions keep going up. Unfortunately, India has been on the development path, but its love for cash has still not reduced.
Exactly.
And therefore, to the extent we are able to bring a behavioral change, moving from the cash to the cashless society, again, in the long run, it's a step to be welcomed. But in the short run, there are problems because we don't have every person who's living in a metropolitan where the geographical coverage as well as the population coverage of ATMs and banks are 100%. In the rural areas, it's not so. It is almost less than 10%. So there are major problems over there. But it's again, as a policy, it is a step in the right direction. We've already initiated most of the safety net programs, and the returns are to be brought directly into their bank account. So Jan-Dhan accounts are being opened up. And therefore, in the long run, if we can actually bring in financial inclusion through this particular move, one should look forward to that. But that's not to say there are not problems in the short run. We have to face them.
So you want to say that the government has moved in right direction from starting from financial inclusion to moving towards the demonetization policy. They are moving towards the right step and they are doing it in the way they can do, and they would improve on the certain aspects by willingly participating in
It
this.
certainly seems so because if you have a look at it, we started off with digitalization,
Exactly.
Digital India, then you have your Jan Dhan Yojana, financial inclusion, and then suddenly demonetization. It does seem to be well drafted, but nevertheless, there are whether it has been done in the right manner, that is a debatable issue, and that is where you talk about a common man being hurt. So one has to be very, very clear about, are we in favor of the policy and are we in favor of the process. Very often you have people who are in favor of the policy but not in the process, and mostly you will find people in that, though there are some segments who are also not in favor of the policy per se.
So the critics, Reuters, Bloomberg's, everyone says that around 6 to 7% of Indian economy, black money, is only in cash, and the other 94 to 93% is in other forms. So what do you think that this step will bring about the corruption levels? How will it impact the corruption levels, and how could government take more measures, and what could be the measures which government could take to uh, stop the menace of black economy and black money?
I totally appreciate your point and accept that also. To the extent that only 6% of your black money is in the cash form, obviously a move like demonetization, if at all it's going to attract, would not never exceed that small amount. Therefore, it is very important that if you want to bring down the corruption levels and our corruption perception index, which is we rank pathetically low in that, we need to improve on it. But by itself, demonetization is not the solution. So long as it's a part of a package of reforms, it needs to be welcomed. But by itself, it's a standalone reform, it's not expected to work. The governments also need to know why every time people are hoarding money.
Exactly.
And if the systems of government intervention, whether it is in the day-to-day functioning of an organization or whether it is to do with the ease of business or whether it is to do with the tax structure per se, if you're not handling these aspects, demonetization is not going to necessarily reduce corruption. We must have systems, institutional qualities have to improve, judiciary has to become so very effective, and most importantly, the public must have faith in the politics. So that's what I'm saying, it's a package of reforms.
Exactly. Ma'am, so after this move, the bank deposits are at all-time high, their stocks are rising. So how do you think that government can probably use this money for the betterment of country and the Indian economy?
See, for a very long time, our monetary policy has been playing the role of having an expansionary monetary policy. Bank rates, repo rates have been coming down. Yet sometimes the governor, RBI, erstwhile RBI governor, was not too happy with the commercial banks passing on the benefit to the lenders and the borrowers. But with this particular move, we've already seen Axis Bank has taken the initiative of bringing down the deposit rates. Also, most of this money is going to come back to the circulation of the economy, and the multiplier effects of white money are much higher than the multiplier effects of black money. So that is one aspect that we have to understand. Second, the moment you have more money into the system, and this is also the time, especially the next 2 quarters when we expect the GDP growth rates to be coming down, all the more it is so very important for the government to initiate expansionary fiscal measures largely targeted in the rural sector, because that is where, as you mentioned, that's the unorganized sector, you have the wage earners and they are going to be adversely impacted. So if you can preempt and start off large amount of infrastructure development activities in the rural sector, economics says the multiplier effects are very, very high. And you could also try to then lower the migration of the rural poor from the agriculture directly into the urban areas. They should try to move into the rural non-farm sector. So infrastructure development, and who's going to take it up? It is the onus of the government, especially now because we are expecting that the fiscal revenues are going to go up. So you don't even have a fiscal crunch. And the time is also right. If you think about the Keynesian perspective of giving a push to the infrastructure, I think governments need to intervene, and this is the right time.
So it was splendid discussion with you, ma'am. What do you think, lastly, that what the Indian people, what would be your message to the Indian people and to all the citizens of India? Like, what should they do in this crisis situation, and what should be the future measures which they could take to
I think as an economist, more than my message to the common man would be to the government. It's a step which they have initiated, but they have to supplement it with the right kind of policies. If those are not brought about, this step would not make the common man happy in the long run. And regarding a common man, I am also a common man, and I have fortunately not experienced any problem because I was already doing online transactions. Idea would be that welcome the move. We are expecting economic benefit in the long run. There are hiccups in the short run. It's a transitional phase, and give some time to the government. If things don't work out, that would be the right time for coming back and voicing your concerns.
So demonetization, a Yorker or a no ball?
I am in favor of the demonetization as a policy, but again I say, just a policy by itself is not what I am looking for, so long it's a package of reforms, and for this one has to wait even more. Otherwise, it will ultimately not turn out to be a master googly, it will turn out to be a no ball, but to make it into a master googly, have the all push, give push to the other reform processes as well.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Done? Okay.